Hi everyone, this video will be public on December 27th, meaning 2 of the best days of the year are behind us. I hope all of you who celebrate Christmas had a wonderful holiday. If you watch this channel, you know that I love Christmas, but I love December 26th even more, as that's the day the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, we celebrate the fall of the evil empire. I am in the camp that the Soviet Union would not have collapsed, at least not at the time nor in the way that it did, were it not for America's actions over the course of the Cold War. That's not to defend every action taken, nor is it a celebration of the circumstances the world was in at the time, but I do believe that global communism was a menace that had to be destroyed. John Lewis Gaddis sums up more or less how I feel in his book, The Cold War, A New History. The world, I am quite sure, is a better place for the conflict having been fought in the way that it was, and won by the side that won it. No one today worries about a new global war, or a triumph of dictators, or the prospect that civilization itself might end. This was written in 2005, I'm not sure he would say the same thing today. That was not the case when the Cold War began. For all its dangers, atrocities, costs, distractions, and moral compromises, the Cold War, like the American Civil War, was a necessary contest that settled fundamental issues once and for all. Sadly, that is also no longer the case, though it should be. We have no reason to miss it, but given the alternatives, we have little reason either to regret it having occurred. If you would like to read a good primer on the Cold War, Gaddis's relatively short book is a good place to start. While I think the world is a better place because the United States won the Cold War, my point today is not to moralize. Rather, I want to take a look at the Cold War from an institutional perspective. The Cold War is often characterized as a clash between capitalism and socialism, which, while surely incomplete, is a valid way to view the conflict. With the United States, of course, as a champion of capitalism, and the Soviet Union as socialism's representative. I would characterize the United States as having a mixed, but relatively free economy, but we'll go with capitalism for the purposes of this video. I also know plenty of leftists who don't think the Soviet Union was an example of true socialism. While I disagree, we'll have to adjudicate that question at another time. Just know that most people, including most leftists, at the time believed that it was. What no one disputes is that the Cold War's legacy has influenced the global economy as it is now, though the nature of this influence is debated. A lot of you have asked me to respond to a YouTube channel called Second Thoughts. For those of you who don't know, Second Thoughts is a self-described education channel devoted to examining current events from a socialist perspective. My friend Kirk Wilcox has responded and even parodied this channel a number of times, and a few of you have been persistent in asking me to do so as well. I appreciate these suggestions, as his videos are a goldmine of content fodder. In his video, Why It's So Hard to Imagine Life After Capitalism, he attempts to explain the ubiquity of this economic system. This definitely warrants an explanation on his part. After all, if capitalism is such a disaster, and socialism is so obviously superior, why is it that the former has flourished while the latter has been all but abandoned? While he doesn't mention the Cold War specifically, he clearly makes reference to it. Unsurprisingly, Second Thoughts is in the camp of course capitalism succeeded, the United States spread it at gunpoint.
The crushing of socialist projects in coups, assassinations, invasions, and wars in economically and militarily less developed states.
That's at least part of his explanation. We'll come back to that later. For now, I want to focus on an earlier portion of the video, where Second Thoughts argues that capitalism has been aided by fallacious assumptions about human nature, and naturalistic fallacies that are extrapolated from those assumptions.
Now the second part of that equation. Competition and greed aren't uniquely natural or the defining feature of human nature. You've certainly heard Darwin's theory of evolution being described with the sentence, "survival of the fittest." And while evolution is a matter of scientific fact, this specific framing of evolution being the product of competition, with the intentional slip-up between two definitions of fittest, is neither neutral nor scientific. When Darwin was writing about evolution, he wasn't doing it in a vacuum. Highly influenced by the writings of economist Thomas Malthus, Darwin saw in evolution the features of a capitalist economy he was reading about at the time, and framed his writing with that in mind. It's not some accident that defenders of capitalism find its features in the Darwinist explanation of evolution. It was written with capitalism in mind. This is not to say that competition isn't a feature of the natural world. nor is it absent from so-called human nature. But it is clearly not the only thing that drives how the world works. As the anarchist Peter Kropotkin observed in ants, bees, birds, rodents, ruminants, monkeys, and plenty of other species, quote, "As soon as we study animals, we at once perceive that though there is an immense amount of warfare and extermination going on amidst various species, and especially amidst various classes of animals, there is at the same time as much, or perhaps even more, of mutual support, mutual aid, and mutual defense amidst animals belonging to the same species, or at least to the same society. Sociability is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. And it's not just animals. Humans are selfless all the time. People, without thought, payment, or self-interest, jump in rivers to save total strangers from drowning, create mutual aid networks, and collaborate with no expectation of equivalent return. If greed is a natural part of how humans and nature work, so is selflessness. The existence of greed is not reason enough to build an economy that rewards it. To put it another way, only observing humans under capitalism and concluding it's in our nature to be greedy is the equivalent of only observing us underwater and concluding it's in our nature to drown.
So, first of all, I don't know anyone who denies that humans are capable of acting selflessly. I personally don't think that facet of human nature lends itself well to economics, because it doesn't scale particularly well. But that's another topic for another day. The main mistake I think he makes, and it's a mistake a lot of people, including a number of self-identified capitalists make, is reducing capitalism to competition. Competition is undoubtedly a part of capitalism, but so is cooperation. Cooperation is a cornerstone of capitalism, and, as we'll see later, it was arguably the key reason why America won the Cold War. But first, here's Kevin D. Williamson talking about the importance of cooperation in capitalism in his book, The End is Near and It's Going to Be Awesome. It is remarkable that we speak and think about commerce as though competitiveness were its most important feature. There is, as noted, a certain Darwinian aspect to economic competition, and of course we humans do in fact compete over scarce resources. But what is remarkable about human action is not its competitiveness, but its almost limitless cooperativeness. Competition is only one of the ways we learn how best to cooperate with one another. Competition is a means to a higher end of social cooperation. Cooperation exists elsewhere in the animal kingdom, but we human beings cooperate on a species-wide, planetary level, which is a relatively new development in our evolution, the consequences of which we have not yet fully appreciated. If you consider the relationship of the organism to its constituent organs, the relationship of the organ to its cells, or the relationship of the single cell to its organelles, it would not be an overstatement to say that the division of labor is the essence of life itself. Birds do it, bees do it, but human beings do it better. The size and complexity of our brains evolved in parallel to the size and complexity of our social groups. The argument for cooperative human action is not just economics, but biology. Our social institutions are just as much a product of our evolutionary processes as our bodies are. And it is through our social institutions, not through our individual brains, that we learn to deal with the problem of complexity. Ironically, by reducing capitalism to competition, Second Thoughts is making a very old socialist mistake. Marxist-Leninist theory taught that capitalist countries of the world would never cooperate with one another due to their infinite greed. Any moments of collaboration, like those in World War II, would be short-lived. The capitalist countries of the world would eventually come to blows over which country would be the chief producer of the world's goods, which would have access to the most natural resources, and who would be able to exploit the most foreign markets. This flawed assumption cost Stalin greatly, at least twice. First, he saw the initial conflict in World War II between Germany and Britain as a fight between capitalist powers that did not concern the socialists. Hitler's invasion of Russia ultimately shattered this illusion. Second, after the war, Stalin was convinced that London, Washington, Rome, Paris, and all the other capitals of the capitalist nations of the world would ultimately drift apart and eventually come to blows due to their insatiable greed for profits, and that only the socialist nations would be left to pick up the pieces. In Europe and Southeast Asia, the most important theaters of the Cold War, quite the opposite happened. For all the coups, propaganda campaigns, and hot wars that America engaged in during the Cold War, the far more important thing the United States did right after the Second World War, when it was in a position of nuclear monopoly and total dominance, was build alliances and rebuild economies, all to facilitate cooperation. As Peter Zion writes in The End of the World is Just the Beginning,
if there was a moment in history that a power could have made a bid for global domination, for a new Rome to arise, this was it. And if there was ever a good reason to make such a bid, it was the nuclear-tinged competition that was arising with the Soviets the day after the guns fell silent in Germany. It didn't happen. Instead, the Americans offered their wartime allies a deal. The Americans would use their navy, the only navy of size to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean and protect the commerce of all. The Americans would open their market, the only market of size to survive the war, to Allied exports, so that all could export their way back to wealth. The Americans would extend a strategic blanket over all, so that no friend of America need ever fear invasion again. There is just one catch. You had to pick sides in the Americans' brewing Cold War. You could be safe and rich and develop your economy and culture however you wanted, but you had to technically stand in front of, the Americans versus the Soviets. Instead of forging an empire global in scope, the Americans bribed up an alliance to contain the Soviet Union. The catch-all phrase for the Pact is Bretton Woods, named after the New Hampshire ski resort where the Americans first made the pitch shortly after the Normandy invasion. It is perhaps more commonly known as the free trade era of the post-World War II period, or simply as globalization.
There was plenty of coercion from the United States during the Cold War, but we also saw that from the Soviet Union as well. Where the United States separated itself from the competition was through its ability to cooperate with other nations. By developing economic and military ties with other countries, the United States was able to work better with its partners to help contain communism. A lot of people point out how geographically isolated the United States is, and how this is a huge advantage. Which is certainly true, except geographic isolation works both ways. As Zion writes,
even with the strength of the U.S. Navy, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are some serious moats, and moats work both ways. The logistical costs and overreach of maintaining permanent, forward-positioned garrison systems several thousand miles over the horizon simply wasn't practical. As the Americans discovered in the decades that followed, it is difficult to occupy a country on the other side of the world if the locals don't want you there. Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan were often more than the Americans could handle when they were managed one at a time. Imagine what it would have been like to occupy Germany and France and Italy and Turkey and Arabia and Iran and Pakistan and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and Japan and China and Korea and Vietnam and Lebanon and Iraq and Afghanistan all at once.
Fighting a global Cold War is a lot easier when you have friends. Russia really didn't have friends. It had hostages. That's why they literally constructed walls in certain parts of their empire to keep people from leaving. The moment people got their first chance at liberty in the Eastern Bloc, they ran for the hills. Hence the jubilation when the Berlin Wall came down, and the Eastern European migrant crisis that facilitated it. The Soviet Union was at one point an ally of the other large communist power, China. But that didn't last very long, and the two nearly went to war. The USSR's relationship with socialist Yugoslavia, the third largest arms exporter during the Cold War, frayed almost immediately after the Second World War ended. Not only did cooperation give the United States much more reach geographically than it otherwise would have had, its economic collaboration with its allies created more resources to draw upon. Let's go back to Second Thought's accusation of the coercive spread of capitalism.
The crushing of socialist projects in coups, assassinations, invasions, and wars in economically and militarily less developed states.
As I said earlier, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent Communist China, engaged in their own coups, assassinations, invasions, and wars, all in the hopes of spreading socialism. I'm not bringing this up for the sake of whataboutism. I'm bringing this up because I think Second Thoughts has this backwards. You see, coups, assassinations, invasions, and wars all cost money. Lots of it. That the United States was prosecuting these measures was unremarkable. That the United States was able to prosecute these measures while not going broke, unlike the Soviet Union, while its citizens simultaneously enjoyed higher standards of living, is what's remarkable. Military victories are oftentimes the capstone of economic victories, and this was absolutely the case with the Cold War. Consider this. When the USSR invaded Afghanistan to help prop up the new socialist government there, President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, saw this as an opportunity to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam War. Sure enough, the United States started sending money and weapons to the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, which funneled them to Afghan guerrillas, including a number of jihadist groups. This helped bog down the Soviet Union in an incredibly costly conflict. What's talked about less is how this war was instrumental in the downfall of the Eastern Bloc. As Victor Sebastian writes in Revolution 1989, there was one overriding reason why Red Army tanks were not sent to Warsaw to suppress the Solidarity movement. It was explained by Mikhail Suslov, perhaps the most hardline apologist for Russian imperialism in the entire Moscow leadership. "We simply cannot afford another Afghanistan," he said, when the Soviet magnates agonized over what to do in Poland. Previous uprisings in the Eastern Bloc had been crushed by Russian interventions, but the high cost of Afghanistan made them think twice. This and Mikhail Gorbachev's wise and admirable restraint were the biggest reasons why the breakup of the Eastern Bloc was almost entirely peaceful. With the exception of Ceausescu's execution in Romania, there was virtually no bloodshed. Not only could the Soviet Union no longer afford to control the Eastern Bloc countries thanks to the bleeding in Afghanistan, living standards across the Soviet Empire got worse, and they were already not very good to begin with. The Soviet government simply could not provide as much, and all across the Eastern Bloc and all the Soviet republics, people had to get by with less and less. Compare the situation to the United States and Vietnam. Vietnam cost America greatly in terms of blood and treasure. And consider that, unlike Afghanistan and Russia, Vietnam was not on the United States' border. It was all the way across the globe. That said, after America withdrew from Vietnam, military expenditures actually increased in inflation-adjusted dollars, while living standards also increased. At the same time, as a percentage of GDP, military expenditures actually dropped. In other words, the relatively free economy of the United States was able to produce more guns and butter than the Soviet planned economy. I'll close by reading this critical passage that Gaddis wrote in the Cold War. What remained of Marx, who insisted that capitalism produces, in an angry and resentful proletariat, its own executioners? Or of Lenin, who claimed that the greed of capitalists would, in the end, breed war? Or of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Mao, who promised their people a better life under communism than capitalism could ever provide? The fundamental premise of all of them was that capitalists could never learn from history. Only communists, who had discovered in the class struggle the engine of history, could do that. Only theory, which cut through complexity while abolishing ambiguity, could point the way. And only dictators, who provided the necessary discipline, could ensure arrival at the intended destination. But a lot depended on getting the history, the theory, and the dictators right. If any of them turned out wrong, all bets were off. This is where the capitalists got it right. They were better than communists at learning from history, because they never bought into any single, sacrosanct, and therefore unchallengeable theory of history. Instead, they were, over the century that separated Disraeli's two nations from Bohein's two worlds, pragmatic, adaptable, and given to seeking truth and results produced rather than dogmas advanced. They made mistakes, but they corrected them. This makes sense, as capitalism, like evolution and the scientific method, is a system that learns from its mistakes. Whether a given problem is solved best with more competition or cooperation, the system eventually learns and adapts accordingly. You don't get that from sclerotic planned economies or rigid dictatorships that enforce these plans, like those featured in 20th century socialism. Ultimately, the reason why capitalism is so widespread today, not nearly widespread enough in my opinion, is because it was able to outproduce socialism. It's simply better than the alternative at solving the problem of scarcity. It allowed for greater competition and collaboration, which brought about more abundance. And for that, we should all be thankful.